I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown. My face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved. The Iron Lady of the Western world.
The Al-Yamamah deal was this extraordinary deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which Ronald Reagan wanted to sell the Saudis billions and billions dollars worth of equipment. But the Israeli lobby stopped it, and Congress wouldn't approve it because they feared arming Saudi would threaten Israel. So Ronald Reagan handed the deal over effectively to his political soulmate, Margaret Thatcher.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
You are a very tough act to follow.
When we stumbled on the Saudi arms deal, the Al-Yamamah arms deal, we really started to stumble on a central feature of British politics over the last 30 years.
His Royal Highness Prince Bandar has been at the heart of many of the great world events of the past 30 years. I was always pleased to see him when I was Prime Minister because he brought me extraordinary insights and bold proposals.
She informed us she considers Saudi Arabia as a strong friend and will be willing to support the kingdom with whatever the kingdom needs. End of discussion. From there on, everything else was technical.
He explained to Mrs. Thatcher that this was a deal with Saudi Arabia and therefore things were done differently. They wanted £43 billion worth of weaponry. That was £6 billion in commissions. The vast majority are what most people understand as bribes.
We continue to work together against the terrorists who threaten the way of life of our citizens.
One day my phone rang, and it was a man called Eddie Cunningham, actually. He said, I've been working for a travel company, and we had a kind of slush fund we used to distribute to Saudis and other Arabs when they came to Britain for BAE, all to help the Path of Arms deals along. And he told these extraordinary stories that when Saudi military officers would come along, he would present them with canteens of cutlery. That was something that they liked. Another thing they liked was girls. So he would take them out in the town and get them girls.
To be honest, it seemed like quite small beer. Payments made, some of them for rather un-Islamic activities. Gaming chips, there were talks about call girls, that sort of thing.
There's only two things that count in business, my friend. Money and sex. The rest, you can write as much as you like, is absolute garbage. You can make a weapon beautiful, depends on your secretary. Because they're more distracted looking at your secretary's ass and thinking what the hell you're talking about. And that is sometimes all the edge you need. I had to use an escort agency called Blue Orchids because of the special taste of the Chief of Staff of the Army, who liked blonde with silicone tits. We had their secretary of the embassy come and review the photos, and he said, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one, I want this one. I had the girls arrive one day before, and I said, girls, I know you've all been paid handsomely for this, but do me a favor, if you get any pillow talk that is relevant, please bring it across, because I could use it. And for each interesting information, I will give another 2,000 euro bonus. So with 60 grand, I signed a contract worth 3 million. So it wasn't a bad deal.
And then my phone rang again. And it was another whistleblower, and he said, you have no idea what it is that you're getting into here. And he said, this slush fund is much, much bigger than you realize. Our job was to look after the really high-level people. Those who used to come to England who were being bribed, essentially, by BAE, were people on the level of the head of the Saudi Air Force, who was a royal prince. We would fly them to Los Angeles and they would buy cars and dresses, and it wasn't shopping like you and I would think. In the end, when they gathered together all their shopping, we would charter an entire jumbo jet to fly it all back to Saudi Arabia.
It was in the attempt to try and trace through the bank accounts who the ultimate beneficiaries are that the case became really very serious, as the trail appeared to lead towards senior members of the Saudi royal family.
The most outrageous example was that BAE, in order to smooth the way with Prince Bandar, at one point made him a present of a huge commercial airliner, all of his very own, which he promptly had painted in the grey and silver colours of the Dallas Cowboys, who were his favourite American team. And he used to fly around in that quite cheerfully.
The case centred on establishing the ultimate beneficiaries of exceptionally large amounts of money paid by British Aerospace for consultancy services.
There's evidence that Mark Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher's son, got 12 million in cash for his work as a fixer.
This is a Star 9 mil. That's okay, it's not loaded. Don't worry. It's a very beautiful weapon. It's Austrian made. If you want to sell on the market, and you're looking probably at about 3,500 euros.
And why do you keep it in the house?
Because I'm a soldier.
And you can do that legally?
Yes and no, but yeah, more or less you can, as long as it's in the house. And you don't shoot the cat of the neighbor. I've got nothing against money. I don't mind paying bribes to politicians. It's part of the deal. The thing about politicians is that they're very much like prostitutes, but only more expensive. The politics is dictated by the whims of the arms industry. Politicians are nothing more than sales reps, my dear friend. They have as much power as a middle-ranking executive in Lockheed Martin. At the end of the day, they do what they're told.
When an executive goes to bribe a foreign official, he says to himself, look, I've taken a lot of risk to take this $5 million that I'm paying to the Prime Minister of XYZ. He makes an arrangement with Prime Minister of XYZ. I'll hand over the $5 million, but you take half of that $5 million and you send it to the following bank account in Switzerland. We'll share in this largesse. The first time an executive does that and he collects $2.5 million, he says, wow, this is a good business to be in. And within moments of that realization, he is now no longer in the business of selling airplanes. He's in the business of selling bribes. And he is now scouring the world for somebody to find to bribe.
Regrets. I've had a few. But then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exemption. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and more, much more than this. I did it my way.
And then the phone rang again. And this was somebody who said, you have no idea what you're getting into. He said, this whole BAE thing is much, much bigger, goes right to the very top. What he had was something that you never see as a journalist, Swiss bank records of international covert payments going all over the world. He showed me how BAE had set up a whole system with Lloyds Bank under which they channeled secret payments into a British Virgin Islands offshore company called Red Diamond. And from Red Diamond, the money went into this guy's Swiss bank account, and he then used it to distribute to the local politicians, taking a big chunk for himself, of course.
I mean, I can certainly assure you, I mean, that we, and I believe most companies, are not in the business of making payments, passing, as you suggest, large sums of money to employees of governments. I mean, it is just not the way, I mean, business is done.
We were actually able to publish what was our most dangerous story, that Prince Bandar had been given not just a plane, but over the years a total of £1 billion.
We did not invent corruption. I mean, Adam and Eve were in heaven, and they had hanky-panky, and they had to go down to earth. So, I mean, this is human nature.
I salute a prince, a statesman, and a friend.
What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests.
All those people who believe that greed, violence, etc., these primal, so-called primal instincts are the real instincts and everything else is a social construction, they've lost their mind. And for the last 50 years at least, policy has been made based on the assumption of greed. And it's ruined the world. Thatcherites believe there is no nature of society, so you have to nurture individualism. I don't accept that at all. I think there are very many good public policy initiatives for creating society. Welcome to Beirut. They are saying hello to you. There's a combination AK-47 Kalashnikov. A society that decides that the bulk of its budget is going to go to arms manufacturing, building up a military, etc., they have made a moral decision that militarism is more important than the creation of well-being for the population.
All right.
It's not the world I want to live in. I want to live in the real world. And the real world is peopled by real emotions, including love and generosity.
My God, if you want, is freedom. The freedom of human beings, of individuals, to pursue their own values.
I think what the term freedom means is economic license. And the economic license of those who control property and those who control capital has, in fact, been a threat not only to equality, but a threat to the freedom of peoples all over the world, and not only in Europe and in the United States, but in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America.
I want you to name me any society in which you've had any large measure of that freedom, where capitalism and free enterprise has not been the predominant mechanism.
The free enterprise system has spread through the force of arms, and those arms were wielded by governments. That was government intervention under the name of the free enterprise system, but a government intervention which destroyed the freedoms of many people, not least of which are the people of Chile.
From the 1950s all the way through the 1970s, the CIA and the US military were engaged in covert actions throughout Central and Latin America, throughout Africa, really throughout the world, where they were assassinating populist leaders, they were backing up right-wing military juntas, funding and arming death squads like the Contras in Nicaragua or Battalion 316 in Honduras, and there were these spate of assassinations across the globe.
In countries like mine, people have been killed to be quiet. To know that any day, any time, you're going to be killed, you don't know how, but it's coming. We were fighting an oligarch, and still we are fighting, oligarchs. Minds that don't want to work on inclusiveness, but just extraction. It's not only about taking from the earth, but taking from the people. Even your dreams get colonized.
The last half of what is called the Cold War turned out to be a very hot war for many parts of the world. From the standpoint of what Iqbal Ahmed calls the victims, or what I will think of really as of people trying to make their own futures, there was an attempt in the Global South to create an alternative imagination for people. But in the early 1970s, this attempt was destroyed. And it was stopped through a real, genuine attempt by the global north to take over the institutions of the world, including the World Bank, the IMF. So it's not simply that the people of the South were incapable of carrying forward their dreams. I use a very strong word. These dreams were assassinated. It's not just the one-off killings, the coup here, the coup there. It's the entire dream that had to be killed.
Los suplicios, las torturas servían poco o nada para arrancar información, pero eran muy útiles para sembrar el miedo. Y el miedo obligó a los uruguayos a vivir callando o mintiendo. En el exilio yo recibí unas cuantas cartas anónimas desde mi país. Una de esas cartas decía: he jodido mentir y he jodido acostumbrarse a mentir. Pero peor que mentir es enseñar a mentir. Y yo tengo 3 hijos.
The joint hearings of the House Select Committee to investigate covert arms transaction with Iran and the Select Committee on secret military assistance to Iran and the Nicaraguan opposition will come to order.
Congress began to address what they perceived to be an insanely out-of-control series of covert actions with little to no congressional oversight.
We have been supplying lethal weapons to terrorist nations, involving the U.S. government in military activities in direct contravention of the law, and lying to the Congress. Now, I believe that democracy cannot survive that kind of abuse.
And people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who were relatively new to government at the time, did not like when Congress said we need to step in and confront the national security state and what's become a very out-of-control kill program. Cheney then went on during the Reagan years in the 80s to serve in Congress. And when the Iran-Contra scandal broke out into the open, Cheney did not like Congress being involved with anything that the executive branch was doing. And you had this utter scandal that emanated from the highest echelons of power. And the Reagan administration was acting as though it had nothing to do with it.
I've told you all that I know, and you know the truth of the matter is, for quite some long time, all that you knew was what I told you.
Did they deceive you? You didn't answer whether they deceived you. Mr. President!
Our witness this morning is Mr. Robert McFarlane, the former National Security Advisor to the President. Mr. McFarlane, we welcome you to the committee, and we look forward to your testimony.
Mr. McFarlane, did you have any discussion about the possibility of, in effect, farming out the whole Contra support operations in Nicaragua to another country, which we'll call Country 1?
Yes, that's correct.
And did you, in fact, succeed in obtaining money from another country, which we'll call Country 2?
That's correct. I had the practice of meeting periodically with the official from Country 2 about assistance we could provide, some cases arms sales, and he intended to provide a contribution of $1 million per month to the Contras through the end of the year.
You have no problems working with the CIA.
We have no problem working with the United States government. And unless the CIA does not work for the United States government, then I think we have a bigger problem.
There have been occasions when some Americans have questioned that, as you know.
Well, thank heavens those occasions was not in connection with Saudi Arabia.
I think that there was a substantial shadow government trying to run foreign affairs for the United States.
These events have been characterized by some pretty strong statements. We've heard talk of a grave constitutional crisis and even been treated to talk about a coup in the White House.
Not only does Cheney sort of defend Iran-Contra, but he argues that Iran-Contra is actually a model for how the U.S. should be conducting its national security policy. He is a radical subscriber to this notion of the unitary executive. Effectively, what you're doing is saying, on certain parts of American policy, we don't have a democracy, we have a dictatorship.
As a matter of fact, I was very definitely involved in the decisions about support to the freedom fighters. My idea to begin with.
In my opinion, there's no justification for further restrictions on the power and flexibility of future presidents.
The national security elite today is mostly composed of people who hit the revolving door multiple times during their life.
The nomination of Richard B. Cheney to be Secretary of Defense is confirmed.
They make a name for themselves in the private industry, and then they come into the government. This revolving door keeps the national security elite very small and very wealthy, and increasing its wealth as it goes up the chain, to the extent that then when you get to the top, as Cheney did, then you can become a member of the plutocracy that runs the country too.
This is an impressive crowd, the haves and the have-mores.
Cheney commissioned a study by Halliburton to find out how much more of the Defense Department could be privatized.
Halliburton, proud to serve our troops.
Halliburton was elated to get this $1 million contract, and of course returned a verdict that, oh, Mr. Secretary, lots more of it can be privatized.
Dick Cheney leaves the Defense Department and goes and heads Halliburton himself. And he spends the entire 1990s building up the Halliburton war empire.
Well, if we're going to talk about Star Wars, we might as well invite Darth Vader. And I'm happy to accept.
Then he comes back into power as vice president, and then they start hiring Halliburton to, in advance even of U.S. troops going into Iraq, Halliburton personnel and equipment was being deployed to the Gulf. It's hard to look at this and not say, these guys had a very long-term plan for how they were going to increase the powerful infrastructure of private companies. What we've essentially done is to create a network of corporations that have the firepower of small nation states that could, overthrow some small governments around the world.
In essence, we in the United States have privatized the ultimate public function, war.
Bombs have got a time limit. They're like food. Munitions has got sell-by dates. You gotta get rid of it. In Iraq, the F-16s and F-18s were firing $6 million within seconds, coming back, rearming, and going up again.
There's no hope of ending war because there's always a small cabal of people for whom war is really, really good business. It doesn't matter that we're losing the war in Afghanistan. Halliburton could care less. It's good for them, good for profit.
يطلع هو
ايش وقت؟
يطلع
ايش وقت؟
يطلع
انا جعان
ما عندي شيء يطلع.
Well, we've undergone a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, to quote John Ralston Saul. 35,000 lobbyists in Washington. They write the legislation, they write the bills.
All it takes is one phone call from somebody on the Hill to someone in the Pentagon saying, hey, turn on the dogs. The Hill's out to get our program. The guys in the Senate aren't on board. We need you to turn on the Gucci shoe guys to straighten this thing out. The Gucci shoe guys being the lobbyists. And what this does is just lock the system up, and that's the whole name of the game. It's called political engineering. And unlike political science, political engineering is real. One of the most important things to understand, it essentially creates what we call a self-licking ice cream cone. And it's like a perpetual motion machine for getting ever-increasing defense budgets. The way we do it is by downplaying the future consequences to start a new weapon. We overpromise its performance, underpromise its costs. We then systematically spread dollars, jobs, and profits to as many congressional districts as quickly as possible so that everybody has skin in the game.
The people who are invested in this state are people like the largest defense contractor in the world, Lockheed Martin. They will die before they see it go.
And while we don't know what's going to change the world next, we're probably already working on it.
Lockheed Martin basically gets in like an octopus and lifts its tentacles, you know, in all branches of the government. And then they hold them. And that's how they operate. They make the mafia look like a bunch of schoolboys.
Fiscal year 1999, 2.3 trillion missing. Fiscal year 2000, 1.1 trillion missing. The Pentagon has claimed year after year that the reason it can't account for the money is because its computers don't communicate with each other.
1 trillion $1 bills stacked high would reach nearly 68,000 miles into space, 1/3 of the way to the moon.
I got a phone call from the FBI saying that I was a target of a death threat. And that's what happens when you go against the big boys. Who has the contracts today to make those systems communicate with each other? And how much have the taxpayers paid for them?
There are times that corporations do things they should not do, in which case they tend to be suspended for some period. There are times then that corporations can get out of the penalty box, if you will.
This company was never in the penalty box. If you could proceed to my second question, please.
The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was.
Individuals operating in the shadows and never having their names called are able to leverage the power of the military and the foreign policy apparatus for their own personal pecuniary ends.
What now? Who's the enemy? How do we justify all these tanks, all these planes, all this bullshit? What better new enemy than an hypothetical invisible enemy called the war on terror?
El 20 de marzo del año 2003, los aviones de Irak bombardearon los Estados Unidos. Tras las bombas, las tropas iraquíes invadieron el territorio norteamericano, hubo numerosos daños colaterales. Muchos civiles estadounidenses, en su mayoría mujeres y niños, perdieron la vida o fueron mutilados. La guerra era inevitable. La seguridad de Irak y de la humanidad entera estaba amenazada por las armas de destrucción masiva acumuladas en los arsenales de los Estados Unidos. Eso sí, ningún fundamento tenían los rumores insidiosos que atribuían a Irak la intención de quedarse con el petróleo de Alaska.
I mean, I think at the most basic level, when we realize how we've entered into a permanent state of war, like what often proponents of counterterrorism on a global scale think of as a long war, but a war without end, something like that. And I think that what we've accepted is a political regime that is sustained by fear. This is a very old political tactic. I mean, Machiavelli asks in The Prince, is it better for the prince to be feared or loved? And his conclusion is, because the locus of fear, the source of fear resides in him, in the prince, it can be constant for his rule. Whereas the locus of love resides in the people. It's in their power. And so for them could be constant and long-lasting. I mean, so Machiavelli already opens a question that he probably doesn't provide us the answer with. What would it mean to have our social arrangement, like the basis of our social choices, be founded on love?
I don't think one has to justify the cost and nature of the national security state. One just has to keep the people fearful enough to support it.
But what I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the al-Qaeda terrorist network.
Every word in that speech was gone over by the Director of Central Intelligence and his Deputy Director. So it was nothing that I made up. It was nothing that I stuck in there. And in fact, some people tried to stick extra things in there that the intelligence community wouldn't verify with multi-sourcing. And I said, no.
Powell grabbed me physically, which was unlike him, and drugged me into a space at the CIA at Langley and said, throw all the material in my presentation about terrorism out. Cut it out.
About this amount. This is just about...
Within an hour, George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, made a spectacular bombshell presentation. We have just learned from a high-level al-Qaeda operative under interrogation about significant contacts between Baghdad's Mukhabarat and al-Qaeda. This was devastating. Here's the Director of Central Intelligence telling the Secretary of State that he has interrogated evidence. Well, the Secretary turned to me and said, put it back in.
Al-Qaeda continues to have a deep interest in acquiring weapons of mass destruction. As with the story of Zakawi and his network, I can trace the story of a senior terrorist operative telling how Iraq provided training in these weapons to Al-Qaeda.
Later, I learned that that was Sheikh al-Libi, that it hadn't just instantly happened, it had happened months before, that he'd been waterboarded in Egypt when he did this, no U.S. personnel were present, and he had recanted within a couple of weeks, and we never were told about that.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
We were, indisputably, we were lied to.
At this hour,
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
As Karl Rove famously said to this reporter, you know, you guys are reality-based communities. We make reality. By the time you figured out, you know, what's wrong with our reality, we've moved on to the creation of another reality.
Did you sell or cause to come into the possession of Saddam Hussein weapons of mass destruction?
Did the United States sell to him? Absolutely not.
Iran-Iraq was on such a scale. And I was on the Iranian side, and I went down to the battle point. I was actually given a gas kit. And so they let me take the train back, right all the way up to Tehran. And the carriages were crammed with Iranian soldiers who'd been gassed. Some were just coughing and retching. And one man was reading a Quran, and every so often he put a handkerchief and wiped the blood off his lips. Gradually, the corridors became permeated with this sort of very sick smell. And I realized it was the smell of the gas that they were coughing up from their lungs. And I was going along the corridors, opening all the windows on the night air to try and clean the train out of this smell of, obviously, of chemical warfare. After 2003, I was being attacked on radio shows, especially from America. You're complaining about the American invasion? Are you pro-Saddam? And I said, excuse me, I was on a train of Iranians gassed by the Iraqis. And the chemical components came from the United States at the very time that your Rumsfeld was meeting Saddam.
You were meeting with Saddam Hussein. I think we have some video of that, of that meeting. Tell me what was going on during this
Where
meeting.
did you get this video? From the Iraqi television?
This is from Iraqi television.
When did they give it to you? Recently
No,
or back then?
We've dug this out of the CNN library.
I see. Isn't that interesting? There I am.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
This very phrase, war on terror, is irrational. It's like saying a war on violence, a war... It's nonsense. You're slipping into this possibility of kind of perpetual war.
Morning, darling. How are you?
Blair kept reassuring us, and we kept believing him, because you don't want to think your Prime Minister is deceiving you in the route to a war. There's nothing more serious.
When the Serious Fraud Office launched its investigation into all the crimes that we were uncovering, it turned out that many of these arms deals had been forced through by Tony Blair personally.
He's a dedicated arms salesman. Whenever there was a dispute, ever in government, he always backed the arms sale.
The Serious Fraud Office got to the brink of uncovering the secret Swiss bank accounts by which BAE was funneling money to the Saudi royal family. The Swiss said, we're going to notify the bank account holders. Bandar flew to London, and Blair swung into action. He ordered the Serious Fraud Office to close down their investigations.
Prince Bandar said if the investigation continued, they would withdraw national security cooperation, which would lead, in the words of Prince Bandar, to blood on the streets of London.
The story we'd been banging away at for more than 5 years. Suddenly everybody woke up to it because everybody could see was a huge cover-up scandal. The spectacle of a British Prime Minister closing down a criminal investigation for his own reasons.
Were you aware that your government was approving payments to a friend of President Bush's as part of British Aerospace's kickback system? Is that why you suspended a fraud inquiry?
When Tony Blair started talking about national security interests, that's supposed to be a card that trumps all others.
I don't believe the investigation incidentally will have led anywhere except to the complete wreckage of a vital strategic relationship for our country in terms of fighting terrorism, in terms of the Middle East, in terms of British interests there.
So this thing's absolutely stank. It seems to be a very expensive way of organising bribe payment. Why don't you might as well cut out the military equipment and just hand out the money?
Blair came to South Africa specifically to lobby that BAE, the British weapons manufacturer, won the biggest contract on our arms deal. And the option that they presented was 2.5 times more expensive than the plane that the South African Air Force actually wanted.
BAE Systems. Real performance. Real advantage.
As Mandela was about to step down from public life, his successor, Thabo Mbeki, made the decision to spend around $10 billion, what were quite scarce public resources, on this weaponry that we didn't need, rather than provide life-saving medication for the almost 6 million South Africans who were then living with HIV or AIDS. The primary reason for those deals was that around $300 million in bribes were paid to senior politicians and sadly to the African National Congress, the ANC, my own party. I was called in by a senior member of the ANC's National Executive Council. He said to me, "Look, Andrew, this is a battle you cannot win because this money, the bribes, were used to fund our 1999 election." And almost immediately, I'm asked to make a statement to the press that says there's nothing to investigate. So it's all over. And I looked at him and I said, "No, it's not. I won't be able to live with myself if I stop this investigation. But at the same time, I'm also realizing that this is the end of my political career." The heads of government are the salespeople in chief of their country's large arms contractors. And this is the template used by large defense contractors around the world.
Companies like BAE are not only sort of effectively part of the government, but they're effectively above the law.
Corruption is not merely a dirty little detail on top of the arms trade. It's actually, in a lot of cases, what drives the international arms trade. Many of these deals would not happen if they did not provide opportunities for personal enrichment.
I would be offended if I thought we had the monopoly on corruption.
JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. 3 months after we invaded Iraq, he held up the Iraq bank for $20 billion. He was then paid $6 million every year. The man is a war criminal.
As I was being dragged out, right at the last second, I'm going to still remind everyone that this guy's a war criminal.
Can I just say, actually, on the record, what he said about Iraq and JP Morgan is completely and totally untrue. I've never had a discussion with them.
Now, I'm not suggesting that there was a phone call between JP Morgan and Blair. It was actually what happened was JP Morgan and a consortium of other banks did in fact prop up the whole Iraq economy to the tune of about $2.5 billion, not 20 billion. I was a bit nervous that day. Then, 6 months after he left office, Blair suddenly signed by JP Morgan for $5 million every year. I was just trying to enlighten the public that there was corruption involved and not just bad decision-making.
I'd like to find out how this gentleman managed to access the court.
There must be a back door in, because they'd all gone out for tea at the time, and there was a courtroom directly underneath the courtroom that Blair was in, and it was left unlocked. So I went through that run, up 2 floors via the fire escape, and then to the door of the court itself. By this time, my heart was pounding like it was really going mad, and I actually lost my courage for the moment. I went and sat down in a bathroom. I found a gents' toilet there. I did actually ring my mother and said, "Listen, I'm here. What should I do? Do you think I should still go in?" And my mum said, "Yeah, go on. You won't get another chance." And I thought, that's it, I'm in.
The man is a war criminal!
Augustine said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. You can serve 2 sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. The more you make compromises with those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And I think that the rebel seeks to keep those who have power fearful.
أنا منتظر الزيدي صحفي صغير أحب بلدي وأكره الاحتلال كل أشكاله. أنا بالشريط اللي سجلته كتبت عليه تصريحي والظرف وضعته في خزانتي بمكان ما، وكتبت بوصيتي إذا قتلت بطريقة غير طبيعية أبحث عن شريط مكتوب فيه تصريحي. وكنت ناوي أخرج إلى المنزل، وعلى أثناء نزولي من السلم التقوا بي قالوا إنه هنالك مؤتمر صحفي كبير. قلت لهم من هو؟ قالوا جورج بوش. أنا مباشرة صعد الدم إلى رأسي لما قالوا جورج بوش. هو كان النتيجة الأولى لهذا العمل هو القتل.
Peace, that's what we want. Freedom and peace.
شوف، هو الحياء هو للاستنكار، وله دلالة أنا وجدتها فيه. لأن جورج بوش لما دخل العراق دخل بكذبة، عدة كذبات، ولكن أحدى هذه الكذبات قال أن الشعب العراقي سيستقبلون بالورود. قالها كلمة في مؤتمر صحفي. تحولت هذه الكلمة بفضل الوسائل الإعلامية الأمريكية الداعمة للحرب على العراق والوسائل الإعلامية العربية الداعمة للحرب على العراق. تحولت هذه الجملة التي قالها جورج بوش: أنت لم ترى صورة للعراق يستقبل الأمريكان بالورود، ولكنك سمعت بهذه أن العراقيين. لذلك أردت طريقة مساوية في القوة ومعاكسة في الاتجاه، أن العراقيين لم يستقبلوا الاحتلال وجورج بوش بالورود، بل ودعوه بالأحذية لكي يستيقظ العالم أمام هذه الجرائم. هو حذاء ينتعل ولكنه له فم.
So what if the guy threw a shoe at me?
كسروا أسناني الاثنان، كسروا قدمي. كان طبعا كهرباء وبالمي، فرقوني بالمي في درجة حرارة تحت الصفر، يمكن 5 أو 7. كانوا يغرقوني بالمي البارد صباحا، وتعذيب بالكابلات لدرجة أنه كان لون جسدي لون الموف الغامق.
I'm going to read you the sourcing of the LA Times report. Paragraph 1, US authorities say. Column 1 still, US officials said. Said one US Justice Department counterterrorism official. Column 2, officials said, US authorities say, US officials said, those officials said, the officials confirmed, American officials complained, they said, US officials stressed. Column 3, US authorities said, Jordanian officials said. We've got a slight... No laughter, please. We haven't finished yet. Several US officials said. Column 4, US officials said. Several American officials said. Officials say US officials, but US officials said. One US counterterrorism official said. I'm not joking. There it is. That is the journalism you're getting fed. And I sometimes think the LA Times and New York Times should be called American officials say.
I denounced the call to invade Iraq publicly. The New York Times issued me a formal written reprimand, which is what you get before you're fired under union rules, to stop speaking out against the war. I'd been the Middle East bureau chief. I mean, I'd been in Iraq, spent 7 years in the Middle East. How can you come out of Gaza and not be angry? What's being done to those people? How can you come out of the Sudan or El Salvador, or, dozens of other places I've been and not be angry? I've seen the bodies of a lot of children, which I can't forget. know, especially having done it for 20 years, it, you know, fucks you up. Dostoevsky said, hell is the inability to love, and that's what kills people. I fully get why people blow their brains out. It's really hell. And I don't use love as a kind of hallmark, schmaltzy, you know, we all gotta love each other. I'm saying that the only way you're healed from those experiences is by reestablishing a connection with that kind of power, with another human being. And if you can't do that, you don't survive. And I have friends who couldn't do it, and they're not here anymore. It's, you know, the power of love to transcend time.
That looks like a GAUB 2 Alpha 38 that we used to have on our loaches. A minigun that fired 4,000 rounds per minute.
One of the manifestations of the national security state, especially in the sort of apogee it's arrived at today, is that it destroys diplomacy. It destroys the will to diplomacy, and it destroys the skill for diplomacy. If you're a small state, like we were for 150 years, in essence, vis-a-vis Spain, France, England, and even Russia, you've got to be exquisitely good at diplomacy. You've got to be able to talk yourself out of lots of things and make deals and compromises and so forth. But if you're the world's hegemon, you don't deal with anybody. You just smack them. You use your military and you smack them.
On May 3rd of 2003, the ambassador of Switzerland to Tehran delivers a letter from Iran to the United States. In that letter, the Iranians essentially offer negotiations to open up the nuclear program for full transparency. The proposal came in. I happened to see it because a copy was also given to a member of Congress that I worked for at the time. He sent it over to the White House and Karl Rove. Karl Rove called back. He said that he found the proposal intriguing. He wanted to know if it was genuine, and he promised to put it in front of the president.
I would call Karl Rove a dear friend.
I've seen a man of far-sighted courage put America on a war footing and protect us against a brutal enemy in a dangerous conflict that will shape this new century.
No formal response was given to the Iranians at all.
I'm grateful to have been a witness to history.
And the argument was that whatever could come out of a negotiation with the Iranians, even more could be achieved by simply removing the regime in Iran. In a way to sum up the argument, however, the principle in the Bush administration said that we simply do not talk to evil.
And as Tony Zinni said, former Central Command commander, if you like to rock, you'll love Iran. That is a 10 to 14 year, $3 to $4 trillion invasion, at the end of which the world, Western Asia, will look not much different than it does right now. It'll still be in turmoil, still be in chaos, and 70+ million Iranians will hate our living guts.
I was in the Pentagon and I went in to see the Undersecretary of Defense. The ideas that Wolfowitz shared with me, he and Secretary Cheney in 91, 92 packaged them, retooled them, thought about them, went to the White House, briefed people like presidents. America needs a new strategy of forcible regime change. So here this idea springs back up again in 2001. I went through the Pentagon in November of 2001 and one of the generals said, "Sir, I got this memo on my desk. We're going to go after 7 countries in 5 years. I said, "Is that a classified memo?" He said, "Yes, sir. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran."
I think it's highly probable the administration has already made the decision to go to war against Iran. There are already U.S. troops inside Iran. I want to repeat that. There are already U.S. troops inside Iran.
The U.S. has long had its eyes set on trying to impact regime change in Iran, and much of what you've seen the U.S. doing with regards to Iran has been on a covert level.
We've seen a report in the New Yorker by Seymour Hersh that a U.S. source told him that U.S. Marines were operating in the Baluchi, Azeri, and Kurdish regions of Iran. Have you ever heard of that report?
I've never heard of the report. I've never read the article, nor do I intend to.
Do you have any interest as to whether or not, as the U.S. ambassador,
I don't.
You don't have any interest as to whether or not U.S. Marines are actually operating in Iran right now?
I said I had not heard of the report, and I didn't intend to read the article in the New Yorker.
If I gave you this article right now and walked it over, would you look at it?
I don't think so, honestly, Congressman, because I don't have time to read much fiction.
We have teams inside Iran, and these include Joint Special Operation Force, our most elite commando unit. It has been given executive authority by the president in as many as 12 countries to go in and kill. We're talking about high-value targets. They're operating now, and they go into countries outside of the war zone, outside of Afghanistan and outside of Iraq, without telling the American CIA station chief or the American ambassador. They go in sterile and they kill people.
We all have to work on sort of the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows and in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies.
Doctrine that has endured from Bush to Obama is that the world is a battlefield, and that the United States has the right to go into any country around the world to conduct what they call kinetic operations, lethal operations, regardless of what international law says. What is President Obama's response to that? How is he going to deal with it? He embraced the very covert shadow forces that a decade earlier had only been talked about in hushed tones in the Pentagon, not just as the implementers of a policy that said we should decapitate terror networks and engage in preemptive strikes, but they became the policy itself. President Obama's administration have built up something called the disposition matrix. It's like an algorithm for determining who should be killed or who should we seek to capture. And one of the more sort of grotesque aspects of this is that there were actually meetings on Tuesdays in the White House that have been nicknamed Terror Tuesday meetings, where they're going through rosters of names to put on or take off the list. Maybe someone within that group has been in contact with someone that the U.S. is watching. They went to the same mosque as someone. They keep ordering pizza from the same place as a Taliban leader. And you decide these guys are probably up to no good. And so on this particular day, we're going to remove them from planet Earth.
So now we're getting into Minority Report, into this sort of sci-fi world of P.K. Dick, where it's justifiable homicide. Even though it's for an act that might take place in the future, it's okay to kill from a distance without a warrant, without a trial, without a jury, and the execution takes place on screen.
Where appropriate, we will bring terrorists to justice. When we went, he went on to, we went on.
Can you stop the signature strikes that are killing people on the basis of suspicious activities?
We're addressing that now.
Apologize to the thousands of Muslims that you have killed.
The voice of that woman is worth paying attention to. Obviously, I do not agree with much of what she said.
The president is not implementing policies that we need to see change. For example, that he would stop the authorization of signature strikes, which means killing people on the basis only of suspicious behavior that's led to the killing of many innocent people.
You know, I posed the question on my Facebook page.
and asked them what they wanted to ask you. And a lot of them said that you were hurting your own cause because, one, you appeared rude to the President of the United States, and two, you just seemed a little crazy.
Well, I think killing innocent people with drones is rude. I think not apologizing to the families of innocent people who are killed is rude. There are a lot of rude things about our policies.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties. For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against Al-Qaeda.
How do you expect the people of Pakistan not to have anti-American sentiments when day in and day out we hear about drone attacks that kill more innocent people than militants? How do you explain that?
Well, I do not believe that there is any basis for your comment.
मेरी दादी और मुझे नीला आसमान बहुत पसंद था और हमारे गांव टप्पी के नज़दीक अक्सर आसमान नीला होता था 24 अक्टूबर 2012 को भी आसमान नीला था
مولتا بيركل زبا خراطاش ولا دو بندي شوقتا بيا باس مونجاز دواد ميناش ولا دمدم بأس شغلي رغلي كيزه بيا كيزا شغلي كيزه رغلي بيا كيزه دم ولا أصلي كاي وتير لكاي غار تكشو بيا مومن داكنل نيوم ولا كدر
ये अब नीला आसमान अच्छा नहीं लगता क्योंकि बादलों में ड्रोन उड़ नहीं सकते
Lockheed Martin, Boeing, DynCorp International, Computer Sciences Corporation, and AeroVironment all told Eric about 70 companies are interested in this $1 billion contract.
As we look out 3, 5, 7, 10 years, this market remains very much a growth market.
It's the disease of permanent war that destroyed the Middle East. It's not Islamic fundamentalism. It empowered all of those who profit from permanent war, politically, economically, and militarily.
Make no mistake, a nuclear-armed Iran is not a challenge that can be contained. It would threaten the elimination of Israel, the security of Gulf nations, and the stability of the global economy. It risks triggering a nuclear arms race in the region and the unraveling of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And how close is Iran to getting it? Well, let me show you. Brought a diagram for you. Here's a diagram. This is a bomb. This is a fuse. Where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here.
The threat from Iran is a political football. What was interesting was that many Israelis, including people from the military, said, as long as there is an existential threat somewhere, somehow, that is certainly helping us expand our budget in ways that is not possible to do in the absence of anything that can be defined as such a threat.
If you were Iran, what would you do? I mean, Israel has, what, 300 to 400 nuclear weapons. They're the ones who started the damn arms race in the Middle East anyway. They didn't sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They built this program in secret. India and Pakistan then went on to do the same thing. And Iran, which did sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, looked around and realized they'd gotten screwed.
The Obama administration wants to sell bunker buster bombs, which can penetrate 20 feet of solid concrete, to the UAE. The deal is the latest U.S. arms sale to members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, 6 nations that neighbor Iran.
War has become a commodity for several reasons.
One is because you need somebody to buy the stuff you produce.
Another US arms deal with Saudi Arabia is in the pipeline, the biggest in history. This deal alone surpasses the entire global arms sales, already $57 billion.
Saudi Arabia does this enormous service of recycling the arms trade. But war is also a business in another sense. There is a business that uses war to get its ends established. This is George Orwell's 1984. Two powers are always going to be in battle, and guess who's making out really well? Of course, the weapons dealers and the people in power.
Well, the ultimate manifestation of the national security state is that it not only seeks a perpetual state of war, it will even go to all ends to create that perpetual state of war.
I'm always reminded of a book I read a long time ago called The Invisible Man. And that book has a beautiful sentence. I am an invisible man, not because I don't exist, but because you choose not to see me.
Prince Vendar, do you know the bin Laden family?
This is ironic. In mid-80s, if you remember, we in the United States were supporting the Mujahideen to liberate Afghanistan from the Soviets. Bin Laden came to thank me for my efforts to bring the Americans, our friends, to help us against the atheists, he said, the communists.
When I last saw bin Laden in this camp high in the mountains of Afghanistan, with an air raid shelter built into the living rock of the mountain, 25, 30 feet high. That camp was built by the CIA. Later, they tried to fire cruise missiles at it. Of course, they knew where it was. They built it. No wonder bin Laden kept smiling at me. No wonder he did.
America and Saudi Arabia put $1 billion each to give them arms, training, equipment. We are the ones who cleared all those people to go. We and you.
There must be something wrong with the way we think, that we can't say that the grammar of the past is operating today.
We have been pumping money, a great deal of money, without congressional authority, without any congressional oversight. Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia is putting up some of this money for covert operations in many areas of the Middle East where we want to stop the Shiite influence. They call it the Shiite crescent.
Thank you.
The Arabic word is fitna, civil war. We're in a business right now of creating, in some places, sectarian violence.
It's an odd situation because we're trying to destroy and liquidate Al-Qaeda in Mali, but trying to give arms training to them in northern Syria. It really is a world gone mad, but oddly enough, you have to be in Syria to realize how mad it is. When you actually are traveling around Syria and you listen to the news coming out of Washington, it's like Americans are living in this kind of fantasy world that bears no relation to planet Earth, where I'm trying to report.
Today, there are good terrorists and bad terrorists. The bad terrorists are those in Yemen, who the United States deems to be a threat. The good terrorists are those who are in Syria. The joke here is we've been there before. I mean, if you consider the Afghanistan story, they've learned nothing. Today, if I say that the Saudis are giving money to groups that are in Syria that are not only al-Nusra but also the ISIS, people will say you are a conspiracy theorist. So what I'm just trying to say is, in the moment of the contemporary, this grammar of dangerous politics sounds insane. So what appears to have been a conspiracy at the time when documents appear, turns out to be true.
We must address the cycle of conflict, especially sectarian conflict, that creates the conditions that terrorists prey upon.
In public, they say, we have to end terrorism. Meanwhile, this private work of getting involved in conflicts stirs the pot, which produces characters that appear to become terrorists, which reinforces the public narrative and then makes things like intervention okay.
Good morning, everybody. Last night, on my orders, America's armed forces began strikes against ISIL targets in Syria.
Just ahead of airstrikes in Syria, defense firms Lockheed Martin, Northrop, Raytheon, and General Dynamics Corporation all set stock price records. Their shareholders are making money off the unusually large number of conflicts around the world.
Every 2 years or so, the Israeli military attacks the Gaza Strip, and right after, there is a trade show in which Israeli weapon companies show their technologies. All of these Israeli companies, which are becoming an increasingly important and very significant part of the Israeli economy, depend on those wars. The first thing that they say when they try to market, we've already used that on actual human beings. By making that claim, they're able to compete with weapon manufacturers from other countries. The United States is the biggest supplier of military aid to Israel. This attack on Gaza is also a trade show for the United States arms industry.
Iran and ISIS are competing for the crown of militant Islam. One calls itself the Islamic Republic, the other calls itself the Islamic State. Both want to impose a militant Islamic empire, first on the region and then on the entire world. They just disagree among themselves who will be the ruler of that empire. In this deadly Game of Thrones, there's no place for America or for Israel.
Today, after 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive, long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
This was a very difficult negotiations, and part of it is because of this entrenched and compounded mistrust that we have built between ourselves mutually for the last 3-4 decades. But I'm happy that reason prevailed, diplomacy prevailed. People exercised a great deal of restraint and patience and wisdom, and we are where we are, and I hope this will be a good beginning.
As this nuclear deal goes through, we're still dealing with the problem that the states of this region are collapsing. And the void that they will fill, you will see more violence and you will see more weapons. It's important to understand that that's not a result of this deal. That is a result of the paradigm not shifting towards demilitarization and collective security soon enough.
The Saudis and the Israelis are on the same page. They worry about Iran. And
can they do anything
about it? And that's not new. They've been worried for a long time.
But can they do anything about it?
Well, they can get their own weapons.
This is the region that has more arms per capita than any other region in the world. Much thanks to the defense industry, Israel and some of the Arab states are going to be able to buy more weapons and more advanced weapons. If the nuclear threat from Iran is decreasing, why should these other countries get a chance to actually arm themselves more?
Pakistan is a friend of Saudi Arabia. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Are you in discussions with Pakistan about perhaps getting a nuclear bomb from Pakistan?
But Wolf, we've known each other for 25 years. You don't really expect me to answer this question.
We're not going to have a truly demilitarization in the region unless Israel's nuclear arsenal also is addressed. The significance of this peace deal is that it is a game changer in the region. And it's going to be a question about the political willingness of leaders to whether they will pursue these opportunities or whether they will fall into the patterns of the past.
Once you start a war, you open a kind of Pandora's box. You don't control it, it controls you. The use of that kind of violence has unforeseen consequences that no one can predict, and it propels you in directions you never thought you'd go. That's what war does. So the images of war are very carefully controlled and countered by the lies that have been disseminated through every institution in society, schools, government, entertainment, the press. When you shatter the myth, and when you understand especially what techno-war, industrial war is about, which is really about murder, about slaughter, people would be so repulsed, it would be very hard to wage war.
El siglo XX, que nació anunciando paz y justicia, murió bañado en sangre y dejó un mundo mucho más injusto que el que había encontrado. El siglo XXI, que también nació anunciando paz y justicia, está siguiendo los pasos del siglo anterior. Allá en mi infancia yo estaba convencido de que todo lo que en la Tierra se perdía iba a parar a la Luna. Sin embargo, los astronautas no han encontrado en la Luna sueños peligrosos, ni promesas traicionadas, ni esperanzas rotas. Si no están en la Luna, ¿dónde están? ¿Será que en la Tierra no se perdieron? ¿Será que en la Tierra se escondieron y están esperando?